John Wick 2, Breaking Bad. This is what they were making. The lore of this lens is basically this was the last photo lens that Angénieux ever made before switching to very, very expensive cinema glass that is basically out of reach for anyone other than production houses that have wild budgets or billionaires. I don't know. So I just drove from San Francisco to LA, driving 300 miles to test these two lenses
in depth, side by side for the first time.
Although I did find one person on Vimeo who did like a test with like Christmas lights, but it was like a 10-second clip and I didn't have much to go on. So I figured I'd drive all the way here and do the proper test, or at least as good as I can do at the time being, with a limited setup in a hotel room to try and see if the Angénieux is really, well, I should say it, if the Tokina is really the same as the Angénieux. I found this Angénieux 28-70 on ShareGrid actually. There's a few listings, but they're very rare to find, and I think the eBay listings are like around, I don't know, thousands of dollars. So I feel this is probably the most expensive lens I've ever like handled, and it's kind of making me nervous. So this one, the Angénieux, is impossible to find and also basically prohibitively expensive to any indie filmmakers or people on a budget. This one you can get for about $200 on eBay, and I think even the prices have lowered since I purchased this. This one was relatively mint, um, coming straight from Japan, and it's the ATX Pro 2. And it isn't the 2.6 marking one, but I've done the research and I believe that the ones from Japan weren't labeled as 2.6 variants, 2.6 to 2.8, but they are in fact identical to the 2.6 ones sold in the US. One last thing I'll say is this whole video was basically inspired by Vistech, the YouTube channel Vistech, which broke down the CineLens manual in such a clear and concise way and how to practically test each lens that I basically am copying his entire method. And if you want a really concise breakdown on how to test your lenses, please go check out his channel. I'll link it down below for reference.
I chose to test the bokeh by using light grid and set both lenses to 70 millimeters wide open to see the most pronounced bokeh possible. This was recorded on the S5 IIX, and the camera settings are pictured on screen. Okay, so here I'm recording the bokeh from minimum focus distance to infinity on the Tokina 70 f2.8, just to give a feel for how this looks. And here is the Angénieux at the same settings, f2.6. And here's the side-by-side comparison. 70 millimeters center frame on the Tokina looks quite pleasing. However, when you move into the corners of the frame, the image gets a bit rougher with less even fall off and more harder edges. In the center, the Angénieux looks a little bit better, actually. There's a little more crispness in the bokeh and cleaner edge with less glow and none of the haloing that we kind of saw in the center of the Tokina. When you look at them side by side, the comparison becomes a bit more clear. The Angénieux just has a softer edge, but still retains definition, while the Tokina has haloing and smudges from aberrations present. In the corners, you can see where the Angénieux really shines. It has much cleaner and crisper bokeh definition across the frame. Side by side, the corner difference is quite apparent between the two lenses, with the Tokina showing the slight haloing all around each bokeh on the corner, which is likely caused by spherical aberration, where the light rays from the outer parts of the lens don't converge perfectly. It could also be caused by the coatings that are used on the Tokina that may allow a bit more internal scatter of light within the lens barrel. The following segment will show how bokeh shape changes as you close down the aperture. Here's the Tokina from f2.8 to f8. Stopping down the Tokina shows that you still have haloing even in the center frame at 4x, and you start to get a ninja star bokeh at f4. And here's the same range on the Angénieux. Stopping down the Angénieux shows that you get a slightly softer, rounder effect on all of the different features. The edge fall off is slightly smoother here, and there's less of a polygonal shape when you're at f4. Also, the highlights look very evenly lit here. There is no bright red along the perimeter of the bokeh ball. As for real life usage, f4 is kind of the best aperture to use this lens at, in my opinion, because it still holds some of the glow, but you get quite a noticeably sharper details. And this applies for both lenses, as we'll see. So, really, the difference here is whether the polygonal, slightly more geometric shape of the Tokina is okay. However, in center frame for both lenses when they're wide open at 70 millimeters, the difference is quite minimal, and you really have to zoom in 4x to even start to see it. But there are some differences. I would say the lenses closely perform the same when they're in the center. Both lenses have a quite pleasing cat eye bokeh in the corners, which is caused by the mechanical vignetting, where highlights no longer appear as circles when you move towards the edge of the frame, due to the geometry of the lens barrel blocking light from entering it at that angle. As we'll see in the real life examples, though, the Tokina really does shine here, and it's one of the main differences I've found between the two lenses. You have to zoom in 6x to really look at it, but the Tokina is not quite as clean as the Angénieux here. For distortion test, I had less than optimal settings to run on this because my grid was approximately 11 by 16 printout. So I had to get as close as possible at 28 millimeters and throw the aperture into f22 just to keep everything in focus. But what it'll show is that they basically have the same distortion, which is not amazing, but it's to be expected from a early zoom at the wide range. For focus breathing, both lenses seem to have the same performance. There's quite a noticeable focus breathing shift between minimum focus distance and infinity, but that's kind of to be expected, and it was never intended to behave like a cinema lens on this. The next test was to see whether both lenses are truly parfocal, as many people seem to claim online. For this test, I focused on the ISO chart when the lens was set to 28 millimeters and then zoomed in to 70 millimeters to see if it held focus. At f2.6, the Angénieux did not hold focus at all when going from 28 to 70. However, at f5.6, it did hold focus. Considering you get the best performance out of both lenses at f5.6 or f8, this is actually pretty useful. The same can be seen on the Tokina, where it's not true parafocal, but once you stop it down, it does behave somewhat parfocal. When performing the sharpness test, I was limited to using another small printout of an ISO chart, but I think the point is that we just are looking for enough sharpness. A lot of the times when you're filming, especially people's faces, a certain level of sharpness is ideal, but too much can actually be a problem. In retrospect, I should have moved the camera closer to the chart for the wider focal lengths, but this is what I have for now. It may be hard to see from here, but the sharpness at 28 millimeters is actually one of the weakest. So wide open, I would say try to avoid 28 millimeters f2.6 or 2.8, and I would stop it down to f4 or f5.6 if that can be managed. It shows low contrast, high distortion, strong field curvature, and the corners lose a lot of resolution quickly. So I would say this is the most optically stressed settings of the lens. Moving to 35 millimeters on the Angénieux, the results are a little bit better. The center sharpness is decent. There's still midfield loss of sharpness, and the corners are soft, but it's usable. At 15 millimeters, both lenses are actually quite sharp. There's better center resolution, better contrast, the midfield holds together the longest, and the corners are more usable here. Then at 70 millimeters wide open, there's a global softness where there's both the center and the corners are noticeably softer than at 50 millimeters. It's already well known that if you want the most glowy, dreamy look, you zoom into 70 millimeters and open it up all the way. Whether or not you see that as a bad thing, this is definitely based on the use case of the lens. In my opinion, this can actually be advantageous when you're taking headshots because a lot of the time the digital sensors already pick up too much detail. So I find that if you're able to nail focus, this can soften up features quite a lot and look more flattering. On the Tokina at 28 millimeters, it's pretty much the same story. You have to stop down to about f4 at 5.6 to get sharpness, and then f8 to f11 is the optical sweet spot. Then after that, you get diffraction. Nothing really surprising here. At 35 millimeters wide open, I think the Tokina is actually sharper than the Angénieux at the same setting. However, it is following the same pattern largely. I would say 35 millimeters overall is a bit better optically performing than 28 millimeters. At 50 millimeters, the differences really start to show between the two lenses, where the Tokina has just higher overall contrast, even wide open. Both lenses have similar resolution, but the Tokina has lower black values. And at 70 millimeters, the difference continues where the Tokina just has a higher contrast overall, and they still have about the same resolution, but the Tokina just looks harsher compared to the lower contrast of the Angénieux. When comparing the Angénieux to the Tokina, it's actually interesting. I believe the Tokina has a little bit more higher contrast at 70 millimeters f2.8 and looks a bit sharper on the charts, although a slightly tad bit more clinical. And the Angénieux has lower contrast, resolves detail, but looks a bit softer. In some cases, this can look actually more intentional than the Tokina. The Tokina looks sharper, but the Angénieux looks much smoother overall when you put it in action.
To look at the white balance, just without any grade, it looks like the Angénieux is pretty close to neutral. Maybe a slight blue shift, but barely noticeable at all. And then looking at the Tokina, it's about the same, quite evenly color balanced. So just the slightest amount of blue shift, which could be from the light setup I was using, but everything was set to daylight balance and 5600 Kelvin for the camera white balance. Looking at the color charts, what I did was apply a color space transform to convert it from Vlog to 709 and disabled tone and gamut mapping. Then I did a slight exposure node just to adjust the overall exposure so it looked well exposed. And then I used the gray card as a white balance using the auto white balance selector. I did this for both lenses, and as you can see here, I have just a comparison tool, and they look quite similar. I would say the differences are very minimal. If anything, the Tokina might be a slightly bit more contrasty and saturated, and the Angénieux is a bit more smoothed out. Differences between the colors primarily, but even that seems like nitpicking. I think I know that the Angénieux or that I know that the Tokina produces beautiful colors from using it for the past 3 years. So, um, since they're such a close match, I think you can't go wrong either way, and any differences can be easily corrected in post.
I replicated the flare test from Vistec, where I basically took a dark room and put a spotlight in it. I was using the Aperture 100D for this test, and I don't have a Fresnel lens, so I just made do with the reflector beam. And I was still able to see a decent amount of spot flares and bay wing flares, so I think it worked. I did the flare test at each focal length because, as you know, the lens extends internally within the barrel, so veiling flare and spot flares affect it differently at different focal lengths. Starting with the Angénieux here, you can see the spot flares quite prominently at 70 millimeters, and then when you get to the offset axis right about here, you see the veiling flare to the right. And there it is again on rotation back. Here it is at 50 millimeters. Spot flares are a little less prominent now, and same with veiling flares. At 35 millimeters, you actually see the most prominent spot flares. And to my eye, I can't see as much as the veiling flare as the 70 millimeters. And at 28, spot flares are also prominent. This makes sense because that's where the front lens element is closest to the entrance of the barrel. Not much veiling flares going on here as far as I can tell. A slight amount. Interestingly, the Tokina has more veiling flares to my eye, but it has less spot flares at 70 millimeters. At 50 millimeters, the Tokina is quite subdued in terms of flares. And at 35 millimeters, again, the spot flares are the most prominent. So same as the Angénieux for this one. The veiling flares also show up a little bit when you're at roughly 30 degrees. At 28 millimeters, there's barely any veiling flares, and spot flares are a little less prominent than 35 millimeters. It's interesting looking at both of the lenses at 70 millimeters. When I first looked at this image, it seemed like it was almost that the Tokina had more contrast. And looking at it again, the Angénieux actually preserves a lot of the detail within the flare. You can even see the individual lines of the 100D's cone filter. While the Tokina shows less lifted blacks and less spot flares, it actually doesn't preserve the same detail as the Angénieux does within the flares itself. This is quite the unusual result because usually I associate veiling flares with a complete loss of contrast in cheaper, older lenses. But here, the Tokina is exhibiting the veiling flare, but still preserving all the detail. So it's quite an interesting result. I would say both lenses definitely would benefit from blocking light from the sun or other light sources. Here's a still frame of the veiling flares I was talking about. And notice on the Angénieux how lifted the blacks are, which we were looking at when observing the spot flares earlier. Now on to arguably the most important part of this whole test, actually putting someone in front of the camera and seeing how it looks. Regrettably, I didn't have much time for this part of it, and if I could go back, I would probably spend the entire time just shooting a creative project using both lenses. However, I still like what I got, so let's go over it. Oh, and one more thing before we start. I didn't have the budget for a model, so you're gonna have to stare at my face again. Off the bat, the Angio really keeps skin tone soft without losing structure. The contrast is lower, but the edges still stay intact. That's why it feels just more natural. I don't know. There's something that is hard to place. I'm inclined to think it comes from tonal separation and not sharpness. Tonal separation, in my understanding, is how smoothly a lens renders fine differences in brightness across the midtones. One of the ways that this actually occurs is from a slightly undercorrection of spherical aberration, which preserves a smoother tonal roll-off. The modern day lenses actually correct as much as possible to snap the edges, but in turn that flattens the gradients of tonality. At 70 millimeters, this might be even more apparent. If I was on a modern lens right now, the spherical elements that they cram in there essentially force all of the light rays to converge onto a single point. creating harsher out of focus transitions and differences in the mid range. It would probably be contrasting every single pore on my face. But here you can see that there's more of a smoother transition between the light and the dark. And that is partially due to this idea, I think, of uncorrected or undercorrected spherical aberration. Now we get to the real question. Does the Tokina have the same kind of characteristics that enable you to get these smoother roll-offs and more pleasing images when you're taking pictures of people? Well, let me put it this way. When I was editing this video, I got confused about what clips were what until I went back to my notes to see what clips were actually from the Angénieux, but I could honestly not tell the difference until I put them side by side and then checked my notes. So I think yes, the Tokina is in the same league as the Angénieux when it comes to being a flattering portrait lens or a flattering cinema lens. But I think it shows the beginning of the trend to err towards the side of overcorrection. There's higher contrast, there's slight less subtlety in the mid-tone separation, tonal separation, and it's just a step closer towards what we consider clinical modern lens standards. So it makes sense. In a sense, they were a couple years into the production of this new lens, more updated, modern coatings, relatively the same element design from what I can gather. But it's just, there's a little slight difference that you can tell when you're looking at the image. At a quick glance, they look the same. But I think there's something to the Angénieux that just lends to a more natural feeling look from the lens. And it's not something you would pick up on immediately, but it's more of an unconscious thing that it takes zooming in to 600% and doing all these tests to even realize that there is a difference. So if I were to try to subjectively quantify how much that Tokina has of the Angénieux's special character, I would say it's probably 90% of it. And that remaining 10% is present, almost imperceptible, but does have an impact, a very subtle one on the general overall feel of how the footage looks. And it is something that obviously matters greatly when you're crafting an image and have a specific look. Regardless, both are leagues better, in my opinion, than some of the more modern lenses from Sigma and Sony, other manufacturers that, while technically perfect, really just are not pleasing to look at for something where you want a softer, more organic image. But that's not to say that these two lenses are not sharp enough to do modern videography work, for instance. I brought the Tokina 28-70 to plenty of corporate videography gigs where it was a sit down interview or event videography, and I needed to deliver a high quality image where they did not care about lens character or cinematic footage. But that's exactly the strength of the Tokina and also the Angénieux is it's modern enough to correct a lot of the aberrations that are distracting to the average viewer who isn't obsessed with lenses. But it has this special character that you don't find anywhere else in most modern lenses. For instance, these next clips are just the same footage, but using a more modern LUTs to grade the footage in a way that would be more in the realm of clinical or corporate work. I've had this idea that photography has a second triangle rule of triangles like shutter speed, ISO, aperture for lenses, specifically perfection, convenience, and character. And usually you can only choose two of those. But with these lenses, I feel like you can kind of get a mix of all three. You have the convenience of a zoom ring. Of course, you don't have autofocus, so it's not the best for that. And it's not the best for perfection, but you max out character, but still get a decent amount of the other two categories. You have decent sharpness and a very useful focal range, but you don't have the perfection that causes overcorrection of aberrations to the point where everything looks like it was shot on your iPhone, and algorithms have corrected all of the aberrations that make us think that it looks more real life or photorealistic. A perfect lens can capture a moment in photorealism. A convenient lens is how able it is to capture that memory, but nothing else. But character in a lens is a lens that can interpret a moment in a way that is off. It has aberrations and flaws similar to a recalled memory. Lenses with character simply just convey more emotion. And I think that's exactly why everyone is looking for those types of lenses now, like the Helios or other ones that are just different and give us a flawed interpretation of what everything looks like around us. More akin to a memory instead of a mathematical equation.